The Grudge. Written by San. 8 p.m. The monsoon rain lashed against the taxi window like a barrage of bullets, blurring the streetlights into distorted yellow streaks. At the end of a desolate, narrow lane in the suburbs of Yangon, a decaying colonial mansion loomed in the darkness. Inside the compound, the sprawling branches of ancient banyan trees thrashed in the wind, looking like gnarled hands reaching out to grab anyone who dared approach. "Miss, we're here. Is this the house?" the taxi driver asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He kept the engine running, his eyes darting nervously toward the blackened windows of the estate. He clearly didn't want to linger a second longer than necessary. "Yes, thank you," Clara said, stepping out into the freezing downpour. This was supposed to be her childhood home, but standing before the heavy teak wood doors, she felt no sense of comfort. Instead, a cold prickle crawled up her spine. As she looked up at the second-floor window, the distinct, suffocating sensation of being watched from behind the drawn curtains hit her like a physical blow. The front door groaned open, revealing Martha, the old family maid. Her face was deathly pale, the skin around her eyes puffy and dark, like someone who hadn't slept in weeks. Stepping into the foyer, the first thing Clara noticed was the smell. The comforting aroma of sandalwood and fresh jasmine that used to fill the house was entirely gone. In its place was a thick, pungent stench, like stagnant water, rotting moss, and damp, freshly turned earth. "Where is Aunt Agatha, Martha?" Clara asked, shaking the water from her coat. "Waiting in the living room, miss." Clara walked into the grand parlor. Sitting rigidly on an antique teak sofa was Aunt Agatha. She looked noticeably older, her face lined with stress, yet her eyes retained their cold, commanding sharpness. Beside her sat Aunt Edith, gnawing frantically on her fingernails. Edith's eyes darted wildly around the room, from the corners to the ceiling, vibrating with a paranoid, unspoken terror. "Did your medical exams go well, Clara?" Aunt Agatha asked, forcing a stiff, unnatural smile. "They went well, but what is going on here? Why are all the windows boarded up?" At Clara's question, Aunt Edith flinched violently. As Clara scanned the room, she noticed something even more bizarre. Every single mirror in the parlor, the grand wall mirror, the glass cabinets, the vanity stands, was tightly draped in heavy black cloth. Yellowing parchment papers covered in red ink wards and protective spells were plastered across the covered frames. "Nothing is wrong, my dear. The house just felt a bit spiritually unclean, so we did some warding rituals," Aunt Agatha replied casually, though the slight tremor in her voice betrayed her panic. "You must be exhausted. Go rest upstairs. Martha, show her to her room." 11 p.m. Clara dropped her luggage in her bedroom. The room looked exactly as she had left it years ago, except for one detail. The vanity mirror was also covered by a black shroud. Being a medical student grounded in science and logic, Clara had no patience for such extreme superstition. She walked over and yanked the black cloth off the glass. "I don't know what kind of madness has taken over this house," she muttered to herself, grabbing her clothes and heading to the ensuite bathroom. She turned on the shower, letting the hot water cascade over her, melting away the fatigue of the journey. The house was dead silent, save for the sound of the running water. She closed her eyes, tilting her head back. Scratch, scratch. Clara froze. The sound was unmistakable. Someone, or something, was dragging long fingernails down the outside of the bathroom door. She immediately shut off the shower. The sudden silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic drip, drip of the faucet. "Martha, is that you?" she called out. No answer. The silence felt heavy, almost suffocating. Brushing it off as her stressed mind playing tricks on her, Clara grabbed a towel, wiped her face, and opened her eyes to look into the vanity mirror above the sink. Her breath hitched in her throat, her vocal cords completely paralyzed. She was not alone. Reflected in the mirror, standing in the darkest corner of the bathroom directly behind her, was a woman. Her long, tangled hair was completely drenched, plastered over her face. She wore a vintage white nylon dress that was soaked through with mud and dark green algae. Murky water dripped from the hem of the dress onto the floor. But the most terrifying detail was her gaze. The woman wasn't looking at Clara's actual back. She was staring directly into Clara's eyes through the reflection in the mirror. Slowly, the apparition raised her head. Through the gaps in her wet hair, Clara saw a face drained of all blood. Where her eyes should have been, there were only hollow, pitch-black sockets. Then, the woman's lips began to stretch upwards. It wasn't a normal smile. Her mouth tore open, stretching unnaturally wide, almost reaching her ears in a grotesque, horrific grin. A raspy, echoing whisper breathed directly into Clara's ear, carrying the freezing scent of rot. "Have you returned?" "Ah!" Clara screamed, spinning around violently, her back hitting the sink. The corner was empty. There was no one in the bathroom. The air, however, was freezing cold. Clara gasped for air, her heart pounding against her ribs. But as her trembling eyes dropped to the floor, her blood turned to ice. On the previously dry, pristine white tiles, a trail of large, muddy, waterlogged footprints led directly from the shower drain, stopping exactly 1 inch behind where she stood. Bang! 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 "Clara! Clara, what is it?" Aunt Agatha's panicked voice echoed from the hallway as she pounded on the door. Clara scrambled to unlock it, throwing the door open. Aunt Agatha, in the bathroom, a woman with no eyes. Before Clara could finish her sentence, Aunt Agatha's face turned the color of ash. Beside her, Aunt Edith peered into the bathroom, let out a blood-curdling shriek, and collapsed onto the floor, clutching her head. "I told you," Edith sobbed hysterically, her body convulsing. "I told you she was here. Evelyn is here." Clara stared at her aunts, a cold realization dawning on her. There was an uninvited guest living in this mansion. Or perhaps the guest had been here all along, waiting for her to come home. Sleep was impossible. The mansion felt alive, breathing around Clara with a heavy, malicious rhythm. It was past midnight when a strange crimson light began to bleed through the cracks of the boarded-up windows. A blood moon had risen, casting long, unnatural red shadows across the hallway. Clara sat on the edge of her bed, her medical textbooks useless against the terror gripping her. Suddenly, the faint, frantic whispering of Aunt Edith echoed from the corridor. Clara grabbed a heavy brass flashlight and cracked her door open. Aunt Edith was crouched at the end of the hall, cradling a headless porcelain doll. She was rocking back and forth, her eyes milky and unseeing. They're coming up from the dark, the cellar beneath the stairs. Evelyn wants her baby. Thomas is so angry, Edith chanted over and over before breaking into a fit of breathless, hysterical giggles. A chill shot through Clara's veins. The cellar beneath the stairs. Ignoring every instinct that screamed at her to lock her door, Clara crept past her babbling aunt and descended the grand staircase. The house was unnaturally cold. As she reached the ground floor, she found a small, rusted door tucked discreetly beneath the curve of the stairs. It was unlocked. Pushing it open, a wave of stale, putrid air hit her face. It smelled of industrial chemicals, dried iron, and rot. Clara aimed her flashlight down a narrow flight of stone steps and descended into the pitch-black belly of the house. She expected an old storage room. What she found made her stomach violently churn. It was a hidden surgical room. In the center of the cramped, concrete space sat a rusted steel operating table. The leather restraints hanging off the sides were heavily stained with dark, decades-old blood. A medical tray sat nearby, covered in tarnished surgical instruments, scalpels, forceps, and bone saws. But one item stood out. Resting on a velvet cloth was a pair of long, silver surgical scissors. Unlike everything else in this rotting room, the scissors were pristine, gleaming with an ethereal, almost predatory polish. Yet the blades were wet with fresh, glistening red blood. The handle was engraved with ancient, jagged runes. As Clara reached out and wrapped her fingers around the cold metal, a sudden jolt of electricity shot up her arm. In her mind's eye, she heard the phantom echo of a woman screaming in agonizing pain. "Please, Agatha, not the baby. Please." Clara gasped, dropping the flashlight. These weren't just surgical tools. This was the life-taking scissors, a dark relic used to forcefully extract life and bind souls. This was where Evelyn had been murdered. Boom! The entire foundation of the mansion violently shook. Dust rained from the ceiling. Boom! It was the sound of heavy, earth-shattering footsteps coming from the parlor above. Clara snatched the silver scissors and her flashlight, sprinting back up the stone stairs. When she reached the parlor, the scene was sheer pandemonium. The protective parchment wards plastered over the covered mirrors had spontaneously caught fire, burning with a sickening green flame. In the center of the room, Aunt Agatha was on her knees, clutching a string of wooden prayer beads. Before her lay the shattered remains of two large earthen jars, spirit traps that had been hidden beneath the floorboards. Black, tar-like sludge and clumps of wet graveyard dirt were violently erupting from the broken clay. Stay back in your graves, I bind you, Agatha shrieked, her voice cracking with terror as she whipped a rattan cane at the sludge. But the sludge was moving. It crawled and twisted, gathering itself into a towering 8-foot tall mass. Clara watched in paralyzed horror as the mud, roots, and shattered bones formed the shape of a massive, hulking golem. Embedded in the mud was a rusted driver's cap. It was Thomas, or rather, the blind, raging manifestation of his vengeance. 22 years, a voice boomed. It wasn't a human voice, but the sound of grinding stones and snapping branches. The golem's face cracked open into a jagged maw, and his eyes burned like hot coals. No, I protected this family, Agatha screamed, backing away. But Thomas was not alone. From the shadows behind the mud golem, a second figure emerged. It was the woman from the bathroom mirror, Evelyn. She was floating inches above the floor, her white dress billowing in an unfelt wind, but she was no longer hiding her face. Clara clamped a hand over her mouth to muffle a scream. Evelyn's stomach was a gaping, hollow void. Trailing from the bloody cavity was an umbilical cord made of black smoke, ending in the tiny, shadowy silhouette of a crying infant. Evelyn glided toward Aunt Agatha. The temperature in the room dropped below freezing. Frost crawled across the walls. "Sister," Evelyn hissed, her voice overlapping with the wails of a newborn. "Does it hurt to die?" "Evelyn, please." Evelyn didn't hesitate. With a feral, unearthly screech, she plunged her ghostly, elongated fingers directly into Aunt Agatha's face. Blood sprayed across the antique rugs. A sickening crack echoed through the room as the mud golem stepped forward, his massive earthen hand wrapping around Agatha's neck and snapping it effortlessly. Agatha's lifeless body was tossed aside like a broken rag doll. Clara stood frozen in the doorway. She was the last blood relative in the room. Slowly, the towering mud golem turned its burning coal eyes toward her. "The bloodline ends tonight," the golem roared, charging at her with earth-shaking steps. "No!" Clara spun around and bolted down the hallway. But the mansion had completely turned against her. The walls began to throb and pulsate like the insides of a living, breathing beast. The floral wallpaper peeled away, revealing slick, bleeding muscles underneath. The carpet beneath her feet turned soft and spongy, like a massive tongue trying to trip her. A fleshy tendril whipped out from the ceiling, wrapping tightly around Clara's ankle. She fell hair'd, her chin smashing against the floorboards. Thud, thud, thud. The mud golem was right behind her, raising a massive fist to crush her. Running on pure adrenaline, Clara flipped onto her back and swung the silver life-taking scissors. The enchanted blades sliced through the fleshy tendril like butter. Black smoke poured from the severed wound as the house shrieked in pain. Clara scrambled to her feet and sprinted into the grand dining room. There was no way out. The doors had fused shut, turning into walls of bruised flesh. The only thing left in the room was a single grand antique mirror, the only glass in the house that hadn't been shattered or covered. Through the glass, Clara didn't see the dining room. She saw an outdoor scene, a torrential downpour, a massive cocoa tree, and an old, open concrete water tank. Standing inside the mirror's reflection, unaffected by the ghostly rot, was the human spirit of Evelyn. She was weeping, holding her hand out to Clara from the other side of the glass. Find the truth. Break the curse. Evelyn's voice echoed in Clara's mind. With the mud golem bursting through the dining room doors behind her, roaring with uncontrollable fury, Clara had no choice. She clutched the silver scissors to her chest, squeezed her eyes shut, and dove headfirst into the solid glass of the mirror. Instead of shattering, the mirror swallowed her like a pool of freezing water. A split second later, the golem's fist smashed into the glass, shattering the portal into a million pieces, leaving Clara trapped on the other side. Splash! Clara didn't land on the dining room floor. She plunged into freezing, waist-deep water. She gasped, thrashing to the surface, but the air she breathed wasn't the rotten stench of the mansion. It smelled of fresh rain and wet soil. As her vision cleared, she realized she was no longer inside the house. She was standing in the backyard, directly beneath the sprawling branches of the massive cocoa tree. But the mansion behind her didn't look decaying or haunted. It looked vibrant, pristine, and freshly painted. Please, Agatha, have mercy. I beg you. The sobbing voice ripped through the torrential rain. Clara ducked behind the thick trunk of the tree, watching as phantom figures materialized in the storm. It was a memory, a replay of the tragedy from 22 years ago. Standing by the edge of an open, deep concrete water tank was Aunt Agatha, looking decades younger, her face twisted in a mask of aristocratic cruelty. Two burly thugs held a bleeding, severely beaten Thomas at the edge of the pit. Kneeling in the mud before Agatha was Evelyn, heavily pregnant, her white dress soaked and stained. You have disgraced our bloodline, Agatha spat, her voice slicing through the thunder. You laid with the help. You carry a mongrel in your womb. Our family's honor will not be tainted. Agatha signaled the thugs. Without hesitation, they shoved Thomas into the deep concrete tank. He hit the water below with a heavy splash, immediately trying to claw his way up the slick walls. Evelyn screamed, lunging forward, but Agatha grabbed her by her drenched hair. In Agatha's right hand gleamed the exact same weapon Clara was currently holding, the silver life-taking scissors. No! Clara whispered, unable to look away. Agatha plunged the scissors directly into Evelyn's pregnant belly. Evelyn's agonizing shriek overpowered the storm. Agatha coldly pulled the blades out and kicked her bleeding sister into the pit to join her lover. Bury them, now, Agatha commanded. The thugs grabbed heavy bags of cement and gravel, pouring the dry, choking mixture directly into the water tank. From the dark depths of the pit, Evelyn's voice rose one last time, not a plea for mercy, but a curse born of ultimate despair. I curse you. I curse this house. The blood of my child will drown your lineage. You will never be free. Agatha simply dropped a burning talisman into the wet concrete. When this hardens, your souls will never leave. Gasp. Clara was violently ripped from the memory, collapsing onto hard, wet stone. She was back in the present. The storm was real. The rain was real. She looked down. She was kneeling directly on top of the old, cracked concrete slab beneath the cuckoo tree. The water tank had been filled and sealed 2 decades ago. The real bodies, the physical remains of Evelyn, Thomas, and their unborn child, were entombed right beneath her feet. Boom! The back door of the mansion exploded outward in a shower of splinters. The massive mud golem, Thomas, roared into the night. Beside him glided the gruesome, levitating spirit of Evelyn. They were coming for her. Clara looked at the solid concrete slab, then at the silver scissors in her hand. The scissors couldn't cut stone. She couldn't dig them out, but she didn't have to. Clara stood dead center on the concrete tomb and locked eyes with the towering mud golem. "Come and get me," she screamed. Blinded by decades of mindless rage, the golem charged. The earth shook beneath its massive weight. It raised 2 colossal fists, hardened by graveyard dirt, and brought them down to crush Clara into a paste. At the very last millisecond, Clara dove to the side. Crack! Crackoom! The golem's fists didn't hit Clara. They slammed with the force of a wrecking ball directly into the 22-year-old concrete slab. The aged, brittle stone spider-webbed, groaned, and violently caved in. The golem lost its balance, tumbling forward into the newly opened sinkhole. A horrific wave of putrid, trapped air exploded from the pit. Clara crawled to the edge and shined her brass flashlight down into the abyss. There, in the waist-deep black water, lay the skeletal remains of a man, a woman, and a tiny infant resting within the woman's pelvic bones. But there was something else. Embedded deep inside the ribcage of Evelyn's skeleton was a pulsating, pitch-black mass of flesh. It was beaten like a corrupted heart. The grudge, the physical manifestation of 22 years of hatred. Clara didn't hesitate. Gripping the silver scissors, she jumped into the tomb. The freezing, rotten water shocked her system. Instantly, the dark water boiled. A small, shadowy figure, the ghost of the unborn child, shot out of the water like a torpedo, sinking its spectral, razor-sharp teeth into Clara's wrist. Clara screamed, nearly dropping the scissors. At the same time, the mud golem recovered, his massive earthen hand wrapping around Clara's waist, lifting her into the air to snap her spine. "Let me go!" Clara choked, her ribs cracking under the pressure. She fought through the blinding pain in her wrist, flipped the silver scissors backward, and stabbed the shadow child. The enchanted silver burned the spirit. It shrieked and dissolved into black mist. Freeing her arm, Clara used her remaining strength to twist her body. She aimed the silver scissors downward, directly at the pulsating black heart embedded in the skeleton below her. "Rest in peace, Aunt Evelyn," Clara whispered. She drove the life-taking scissors straight through the black mass. Squelch. Time seemed to stop. A deafening, high-pitched wail erupted not from the ghost, but from the house itself. A blinding, pure white light exploded from the skeletal remains, tearing through the darkness of the pit. The mud golem holding Clara suddenly froze. The hardened earth of his body began to dry, crack, and turn to ash. The golem dropped Clara into the water and slowly looked at her. The burning coal eyes faded, replaced by the sorrowful, human eyes of Thomas. Thank you, a male voice whispered into the wind. The golem crumbled into a pile of lifeless dirt. The horrific apparition of Evelyn hovering above the pit dissolved, her rotting face shifting for a brief second into a peaceful, beautiful smile. Then everything went quiet. The curse was broken. Clara climbed out of the pit, collapsing onto the wet grass. She looked toward the mansion. The fleshy, pulsating nightmare was gone. The house had instantly aged. The paint was peeling, the roof was sagging, and the windows were shattered. Without the dark energy sustaining it, it was just an empty, decaying ruin. Epilogue. The river. Morning sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a warm, golden glow over the Yangon River. The police had arrived at the mansion hours ago. They found the bodies in the concrete tank, and they found the crushed remains of Aunt Agatha beneath a fallen chandelier in the parlor. Aunt Edith was taken away by an ambulance. Finally at peace, her mind quiet for the first time in 2 decades. Clara stood alone on a bridge overlooking the deep, rushing currents of the river. She looked down at her wrist. The bite mark from the ghost child had faded from a sickly black to a normal, pale pink scar. It was over. She had survived. In her hands, she held a cloth bundle. She unwrapped it, revealing the life-taking scissors. Without the dark magic of the grudge, the silver had completely tarnished. It looked like nothing more than a rusted, useless piece of scrap metal. Clara rewrapped the scissors and tossed the bundle over the edge of the bridge. Splash! She watched as the heavy metal sank beneath the murky surface, taking the tragedies, the secrets, and the horrors of her family's bloodline down to the bottom of the river, never to be seen again. Clara turned her back to the water, pulled her coat tighter against the morning breeze, and walked away.